This video is on the third of the big questions, or the pitfalls of regression analysis. And so this is on self-selection bias. And so this isn't to be confused with sample selection bias, where people select themselves into a sample. This has to do with people selecting themselves into certain values of the key X variable or the treatment. Okay, so Yogi Berra once again gave us a great quote on this concept. And so he said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it, rather than choosing your path randomly, as this will vex academic researchers who aim to estimate the causal effects of your choices. Okay, so self-selection bias is unfortunately the concept that people choose their X value or their key X value, or that key X value is determined in a way that could be related to the benefits and costs of the choice in terms of how the outcome, how the dependent variable is affected. So basically what's happening is that we're observing more of the effects for the people or the entities who benefit more from the treatment, or who are perhaps harmed less by the treatment. Let's say that there are two people in the sample, and we want to estimate what's the effect of college on income. And so the two people here are Charlie and David. David likes manual labor, Charlie likes to work with computers. And let's say that if neither goes to college, then they both would earn $30,000. But if they do go to college, get their college degree, Charlie would end up getting a job at some tech firm, maybe get $110,000. David, on the other hand, well, he still likes to do manual labor, and so he would get, let's say, only $50,000 if he were to go to college. Okay, and so the effect of college for these two people, well, for Charlie it's $80,000, for David it's only $20,000. And so here, the average effect of college in the sample, so the average treatment effect is going to be $50,000. This is what we want to estimate. This represents, okay, in this sample, and hopefully then we can extrapolate to the population, what is the average effect of a college education on people's income? Okay, but the likely scenario is that Charlie goes to college, earns that $110,000. David probably doesn't go to college. It's just not worth it for him to bear the cost of college for a much lower reward. And so David probably will not go to college and only earn $30,000. And so when we compare the income for the person who goes to college versus the income for the person who doesn't, well, now we're getting an $80,000 difference. And that's our estimated effect of a college education. Okay? And so what's happening is that we're overstating the true average college effect. The true effect was $50,000. We're estimating it to be $80,000. And this is self-selection bias, because the person who had the greater effect of college is the one who actually went to college. Okay, so in the last example we had income, which is a good outcome. Now let's consider an example with a bad outcome. And the outcome we have here is a behavioral problems index. Okay, so the research question is, how does a parental divorce affect a child's behavioral problems index? So we would regress BPI, the index, on certain X variables, and then D being whether or not the parents divorce. Okay, so let's suppose that we have 5 kids, Alfred, Betty, Charlie, Dia, and Engelbert. And let's suppose that there's this unobserved baseline BPI, let's say after you factor out or adjust for the variables in X. And so just for the sake of simplicity of the exercise, we'll assume that it's 50, in other words, a median on a 0 to 100 scale, say. So value of 50 BPI for each child. Okay, and then of course, it's not reasonable to think that every child would have the same effect. Rather, that effect, that beta 2, is going to be different for each child. Each child is going to be affected differently by the divorce. And so let's say that Alfred would actually have reduced behavioral problems as a result of the divorce. Betty would be unaffected, and then Charlie, Dia, and Engelbert would have increasing problems as a result of the divorce. So what self-selection bias would entail is that the parents have a general idea of what the kid's beta 2 looks like, what the effects of the divorce would be for the children. And then they decide whether to divorce partly based on what the child's beta 2 is. Okay, and so in this situation, I made it so that, well, yeah, the parents of Alfred and Betty decide to divorce because they think, okay, this actually might help Alfred. Betty may not be that much affected. Whereas in contrast, the parents for Charlie, Dee, and Engelbert do not divorce, because, in part perhaps, because they think, hey, this will really affect the child. Okay, so then what I have in this last column is the actual observed BPI, okay, which is going to be the baseline one plus beta 2 if there actually is a divorce. And so for Alfred, well, yes, the divorce is turned on here for Alfred, and so we add the -2 to the 50. So Alfred actually has an improvement in outcomes, a lower behavioral problems index. Betty's, we're adding the 0 to the 50, and for Charlie, Dee, and Engelbert, there is no, we add nothing because there was no divorce. So, and so they don't experience this effect. They don't get assigned that beta 2. They're not getting the effects of the divorce. Okay, and the first question here is, what is the true average treatment effect? Meaning, if every child experienced a parental divorce, what is the average effect on their BPI? Okay, and that's just going to be the average of the betas. So the -2 plus 0 plus 2 plus 4 plus 6 divided by 5 people, and that's going to give us 2, a positive 2. That's your average treatment effect. That's what we hope to estimate. Okay, again, note here that the parents who divorce are those whose children have the lower beta 2. Okay, and so what are we getting with the estimated average treatment effect? Okay, well, it's going to be basically the difference in the means for those with a divorce equals 1 versus those with a divorce equals 0. Okay, so the expected BPI for those with a divorce equals 1 is going to be the average of 48 and 50. And that's going to be 49. Okay, the expected BPI for those with a divorce equals 0, that's going to be the average of these three, where the divorce equals 0, and that's just going to be 50. So we're getting a -1 for that difference, and that's our estimated average treatment effect. Okay, what's the direction of the bias? Well, the true effect was 2. We're getting an estimated effect of -1. And so it's a negative bias on our estimated effect of the divorce. Okay, here's a little more of a realistic scenario, that there's going to be a wide distribution of beta 2s. Okay, it's probably going to be a somewhat smooth function. Whether it's symmetrical or not, I'm guessing it's probably not symmetrical, but I have no idea what the real distribution looks like. Okay, now I put this 0 here just as a little orientation that I'm guessing that the average effect of the divorce on behavioral problems is positive, and that's just why I put the 0 a little to the left of the mean beta 2, or the true average effect. Okay, and what self-selection bias would entail is that the children with the betas down here are the ones who are more likely to have their parents divorce, because the parents will at least suspect that their children are not going to be that affected by the divorce, and it may actually help them. Okay, now it's certainly not going to be perfect. There's going to be some people down here who end up not divorcing. There's going to be children up here with a larger positive effect on behavioral problems. In other words, more problems for children as a result of the divorce. Some of the parents up here will actually divorce. But the idea is, okay, we're going to realize more of these effects, and that's going to lead to an underestimate of the true average effect. So let's think about, how do we determine the direction of the bias? Well, in the first case where we looked at the effects of college on income, that's a good positive outcome, and the direction of the bias was positive. The average treatment effect was 50,000. We estimated it to be 80,000. When we're looking at a bad outcome, or in other words, a negative outcome, the effects of divorce on behavioral problems, well, then the direction of the bias was negative. And this is the pattern. If it's a good outcome, self-selection bias, if it is there, will result in a positive bias. If it's a bad outcome, it's going to result in a negative bias. Okay, one common misperception that people have, they say that self-selection bias occurs when people choose their Y value, basically choose their outcome, and that's not the case. It's choosing the value of your key X variable or your treatment variable. All right, so let's consider the different criteria for self-selection bias. So first comes down to, can individuals or the subjects choose or determine their own X value to some extent? And by X value, I mean for the key X variable or the treatment. Okay, then, is there meaningful variation in the population in how X affects Y? That is, in what the treatment effect would be. And would individuals have some sense of what their own individual effect would be? Okay, do people know what the treatment effect would be for them? And then third, is how the X variable affects Y for the individual a meaningful part of how the X value was determined or how they made their choice? Okay, now these are very difficult to know for sure. It's what I call squishy. But what you have to think about is if it is conceivable, well, then you should just acknowledge it at the very least. Maybe try to address it if possible. Often it's not going to be easy to address. Okay, so let's apply the criteria to a couple examples. And the first one will be, how does a college education affect income? And so the first criterion would ask, can individuals choose whether they go to college or not? Can they choose their own X value? Do they go to college? Okay, and I think the answer to that is clearly yes. Okay, and then second, is there meaningful variation in the population in how X affects Y, how college affects income? And would people have a good sense of what the effect of college on income would be for them? Here I would say yes as well. Some people think, hey, if I go to college, I think I have the capacity to be a good lawyer or a good doctor. There's going to be a nice financial reward for me. Other people may not have such aspirations, may not think that there would be as much of an effect of college education on income for them. Okay, and then third is how a college education affects their income for the individual. Is that a meaningful part of how the value of X is determined or chosen? So is it a meaningful part of why they choose to go to college or not? And here again, I think it would be yes. Okay, so with how college education affects income, there's probably going to be this self-selection bias. Okay, next problem. How does the state unemployment rate affect teenage marijuana use? And so the first question would be, can individuals choose or determine their own X value to some extent? Okay, no, probably not. Teenagers are just basically given their unemployment rate. Even if people could move to a state with lower unemployment rates, it's probably not a meaningful reason why some people have high versus low unemployment rates. So I would say the answer to that is no. It stops right there. There would not be any self-selection bias for this issue of, does the state unemployment rate affect teenage marijuana use?